Good afternoon and good morning. Thank you for joining us and welcome to NCSL's fifth in a series of webinars on the state and federal response to the COVID pandemic. Today's webinar focuses on state and federal response related to education, childcare, and nutrition. My name is Arturo Perez, and I will be moderating the webinar today. I am the Director of NCSL State. COVID-19 continues to be a top concern for all of us. Policymakers are taking extra steps to respond to and anticipate impacts of the virus. NCSL is committed to providing our members with timely responses to state research requests and the essential knowledge needed to guide state action. This webinar is intended to highlight federal and state action in response to the coronavirus, as well as provide you with the resources as you navigate this ever-changing and unprecedented situation. Please contact us for research or other support services. Today's webinar is a platform for information engagement, and we hope that it answers your questions about the federal and state responses to COVID-19 related to childcare, education, and nutrition programs. Please use the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen to submit your questions to our presenters. We encourage you to type in your questions and any answers if you have them throughout the presentation. Many of you will want to download the slides for today's webinar. You can find a PDF version of the slides by opening the tab labeled Resources. The tabs are found just above the presentation window. Another tab is labeled Speaker, where you can read the bios of today's speakers. You can have access to these tabs at any time during the presentation. If you have trouble downloading the presentation, please email me at arturo.perez@ncsl.org, and I will send you the deck of slides. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website within the week. The National Conference of State Legislatures is the bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and legislative staff of the states, commonwealths, and territories by providing research, technical assistance, and opportunities for policymakers to exchange ideas on the most pressing state issues. NCSL is an effective and respected advocate for the interests of the states in the American federal system. NCSL's COVID-19 webpage houses our comprehensive resources on state and federal response to COVID-19. Here you can find the archives of the previous webinars, information on state policies and response related to public health, continuity of government, education, fiscal, elections, and other important considerations during this unprecedented time. Today we have 4 NCSL staff who will share their expertise with us: Jenny Palmer, Michelle Ekstrom, Austin Reed, and Ann Morse. Remember to click on the speaker tab to read their bios. On deck first is Jenny Palmer, Policy Associate, Early Care and Education Project, NCSL's Children and Families Program. She will address the state response related to child care and child care workers. Jenny?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, I'm going to carry on. If you are like me and the millions of other parents who are without childcare or school during this crisis, you have become very familiar with how difficult it can be to balance working while attempting to keep your children occupied, maybe even learning something, in the room next to your makeshift home office. You've likely developed a whole new appreciation for your childcare provider in the last few weeks. While we are certainly facing new challenges at this unprecedented time, many of them stem from larger issues that have been around for a long time. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the challenges within childcare prior to this current public health crisis. Parents of the 12 children between the ages of 0 and 5 who spend an average of 30 hours a week in non-parental care under normal circumstances face 2 major challenges. Those are availability and affordability. So in nearly all parts of the country, both urban and rural, there's a serious shortage in supply in childcare options. That includes both center-based and in-home care, also called family childcare, which makes up the vast majority of childcare providers in this country. In the last decade, we've seen a decline by 20% in family childcare providers. The second issue is costs. Care for children under the age of 5 is simply unaffordable for many families and can account for a significant portion of household income, an average of 10% for the median household income for married couples with just 1 child. For single parents, it can reach an average of 36% of total income. There's also very limited access to financial assistance for child care for low-income families. Only about 1 in 6 or 7 families who are eligible for this assistance actually receive it. When families can't find or afford quality care, they may end up resorting to care that is of lower quality, perhaps outside of a state's licensing system, which can pose health and safety risks and is not known to benefit children's development the way we know high-quality early care education opportunities do. For providers, despite what can seem like a high price tag to the parents, the fees that child care providers end up receiving don't really match what's needed. Child care is a labor-intensive field. It requires a certain number of qualified early educators in the room with children. There's no shortcutting that. So what we're left with is an unstable business model for parents who can't afford more and providers who are earning poverty-level wages, an average hourly wage of just $11. Nearly half of them are enrolled in some sort of public assistance program like SNAP or what we used to call food stamps, and they're often without access to benefits like paid sick leave. So these challenges are only magnified by the current crisis that we're in. Parents who are already feeling squeezed to afford childcare may now be struggling even more as millions have lost their jobs or have had their income otherwise reduced. For providers, this loss of income could mean the permanent closure of their businesses. As many as 30% of all of all providers reported in a recent survey done by the National Association for the Education of Young Children said that they would not be able to survive weeks-long closures without some sort of support or outside investment. Closures mean essential workers might not have access to care right now, and that other families could be without care when they are ready to go back to work. Providers who stay open, of course, are risking their own health and that of their families, and many are facing challenges accessing the supplies they need, like additional cleaning materials. Before I get into how states are responding to these challenges, I want to give you a quick summary of some components, certainly not an exhaustive list, but from recent federal legislation that could directly affect child care in your state. The most recent legislation, the CARES Act, passed on March 27th, includes $3.5 billion for child care development block grants. This is an existing funding stream administered by states that primarily provides financial assistance for child care for low-income families, as well as funds for health, safety, and quality improvement. These new funds can now be used to pay providers' salaries or wages, even in times of decreased attendance or during closures as well. Funds can also be used to provide care to essential workers without regard to income eligibility and to provide cleaning and sanitation assistance to all providers. I've listed a few other components here included in the CARES Act that could impact child care providers who, as I mentioned, are often self-employed and less likely to have access to benefits, such as paid sick leave or unemployment insurance. But keep in mind that the exemptions allowed under this law to small businesses who employ fewer than 50 employees, which could certainly include child care, and thus exclude child care workers from these benefits. There's also funding for small business loans, which in some cases can include nonprofits for which child care programs could be eligible. But it's important to remember that accessing these types of supports for which they have historically been ineligible may be unfamiliar territory to child care business owners. So this could be an opportunity for state policymakers to consider how you or an organization in your state can support child care business owners to navigate these processes and obtain new resources. At the state level, we're seeing states grapple with whether to include child care programs in their stay-at-home mandates. The majority, those in blue on the map, are allowing programs to stay open. And the reason for that, at least in some states, is that they're considering child care as part of essential services in order to ensure that parents who need to work or are required to still have access to care. At least 15 states have directed child care programs to close for a certain amount of time, with exceptions made for those providing care to the children of essential workers. Since I created this slide 2 days ago, Michigan and North Carolina have also joined this group, marked in gold on the map. And one state has closed child care programs down completely, that is Rhode Island, where all child care licenses have been suspended until April 4th. though the state is supporting and paying for child care for frontline workers through a unique partnership with care.com. Other ways states are responding is by expanding access to child care assistance. Again, this is primarily through the use of CCDBG funds, those federal dollars. The federal government has released a few documents linked to here regarding flexibility with the use of these funds during this emergency. This allows states to serve more families by waiving income and worker education requirements, extending eligibility periods for families who are already enrolled, addressing co-pays, expediting the enrollment of new qualified providers, and amending the populations for which to prioritize funding, which can include essential workers. So that brings us to the targeted efforts states are making to ensure these workers have access to care at this time when they are needed more than ever. States like Rhode Island and Wisconsin are taking steps to first identify essential workers in need of care through surveys or online forums. Once those workers have been identified, some states have set up networks to then connect essential workers to existing licensed child care providers who have openings, perhaps because other families are keeping their kiddos at home. Some states are setting up emergency care centers just for the children of essential workers in currently unoccupied spaces like a YMCA or a K-12 school. Others like Ohio, Kentucky, New Mexico are making temporary changes or expediting parts of their child care licensing procedure in order to bring on new providers quickly. And states like Colorado and Texas are offering financial assistance to essential workers needing child care, in some cases covering the full cost or offering bonuses to providers who prioritize essential workers. As I mentioned previously, the passage of the CARES Act, all states will have more money to meet the child care needs of essential workers moving forward. And I'll just add here that every state defines essential workers a little bit differently. Some are even including child care providers in that definition because, of course, you may not be able to go to work to care for someone else's child if you yourself are in need of care. And lastly, so a few other supports that states are offering to child care providers at this time include using those CCDBG dollars to continue to pay providers even when they're closing, potentially basing those payments on enrollment, not attendance, because again, families might be keeping their kids at home. They're also helping to cover some of the costs providers might be losing because private pay parents are unable to pay right now due to maybe a job loss. States are also temporarily authorized to use CCDBG dollars to fund short-term grants or assistance to providers in order to help them retain the child care supply. And states like Colorado and Rhode Island have explicitly named child care workers among those eligible for paid sick leave and unemployment benefits through their states. And lastly, all states are providing guidance on new health and cleaning standards to child care programs that remain open. Some are recommending new restrictions on the number of staff or children that can be in attendance or within one room. States are working to ensure that providers have access to essential supplies like diapers, formula, milk, in addition to those cleaning supplies. So I know we've got a lot to cover. I'll stop right there and I'll be happy to take your questions after Michelle's presentation.
Thank you, Jenny, for that important information on childcare. I'm sure it will generate many questions which we will have time for after our next presenter. Our next presenter is Michelle Ekstrom, the Group Director for NCSL's Education Program. She will present the state education response to COVID-19. Michelle?
Thanks, Arturo, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As you know, COVID-19 is dramatically affecting the delivery of education across the states. And so today I'm going to discuss the current state of both K-12 and higher education, immediate concerns that are facing states, long-term effects that legislators and others in the states will have to address, and state legislation that we've been seeing that has recently been introduced. So first I'm going to start with the current state of K-12 education. 48 states have mandated the closure of all schools. Nebraska and Iowa have not mandated closures of all schools, but the governor has strongly recommended the closure, and in speaking with some staff from Nebraska and Iowa, it's anticipated that they may issue an order very soon. So we're looking at a situation where all schools across the United States, for the most part, are closed. As a result, many states have waived attendance requirements and aren't collecting attendance data that may have been required under their accountability system. And most are moving to a virtual classroom or distance education. And along with that comes the cancellation of state and district tests. And also, most schools are distributing meals as well. So immediately, states are having to deal with a large number of issues at both the state level and the school district level. First and foremost, it's communication. State education officials as well as local school district officials are trying to put together robust communication plans with both parents and students so that everyone knows what's happening. That's been a big challenge, especially in communities that are rural, or for students or parents who are English learners. And so communication is really important and detrimental right now. And almost as immediately, schools needed to figure out how they were going to continue to distribute school meals. Both breakfast and lunches are an essential part of the services that schools provide to students, and so they needed to come up with a plan for continuity for distribution of the school meals. And we will be discussing that in more detail during the nutrition portion of this webinar. Because schools are closed, they needed to immediately come up with a plan to continue to offer education and learning opportunities for students. So most, if not all, have moved to implementing distance learning. This is a challenge because most school districts don't have the infrastructure and teachers are not currently trained for this particular environment. We also know that students with disabilities as well as English learners are not well served in this particular format, and there's a lot of concern around access to technology, both devices as well as internet. And so schools and districts are really having to scramble to determine what the next steps may be here. They're also having to determine grading. How do you grade in this particular learning environment where teachers aren't real trained for this and students aren't used to it? So how will they evaluate the amount of learning that's going on? And then how will students who are supposed to be sitting for exams like their SAT, ACT, and their PSAT to determine college and career readiness, how will those exams be scheduled and how will they continue? And then, of course, for those seniors, they're very concerned about graduation. How are they going to reschedule graduation? Will it go on? Will it be virtual? How will you determine who is eligible for graduation in a scenario where we may be going to a pass-fail system? Long-term effects are of great concern for many state legislators. The academic and social and emotional learning loss is top of mind, as well as the existing and what we know is sure to be an increased opportunity gap, those who have access to continued learning and those who will not, and how does that eventually affect student achievement long term. We know that equity becomes a big issue when we know that not all students are well served under this circumstance, as I mentioned, especially those with disabilities or who are English language learners, or who are low income and may not have appropriate access to the digital devices or the internet. And top of mind was already student mental health, especially for middle and high school students. So how will we continue to service, or what kind of additional stresses are we going to be seeing in those students in this time? And then we know school budgets are going to be dramatically impacted with the shortfalls and loss in revenue from both sales and property tax that support school budgets. We at NCSL are working very hard in keeping track of this and trying to anticipate what this might mean. So we will continue to provide opportunities to get that information out to you. We know that there could potentially be impact on school personnel. We already were in a crisis for recruiting and retaining high quality teachers. So we know that this will dramatically impact those opportunities. And we also know this is going to impact school accountability and longitudinal data systems. Those tests are really crucial for helping states understand how well schools are servicing students and helping them to learn and getting them where they need to be in order to be prepared for college and career readiness. And without the data, we know that there's going to be a lapse in information. So now let's turn to the state of higher education. More than 1,100 colleges and universities have closed their campus. Most have shifted now to online coursework. And we heard a lot in the news about the abrupt closures of dorms and dining halls and the impact that it had on these college students who then quickly needed to find a place to live, whether that be returning home or within the city where they were at, and how do they have adequate access to food, especially for low-income students. Many schools have also canceled and postponed commencement, and there was a real abrupt loss of work study for on-campus jobs for those students who are eligible for work study. And we know this is going to dramatically affect the recruitment and admissions process, which has been slowed in many cases. So of immediate concern, as I mentioned, is the housing and transportation for students. Many students just received a couple days' notice that they needed to be off campus and somewhere else. And so some universities are considering prorated refunds for housing expenses. Some provided some stipend or a short-term loan to the students to use that for transportation or for housing. Work study is, as I mentioned, a significant issue. The federal legislation has addressed that in part, and Austin will be talking about that a bit. The universities needed to quickly stand up distance learning, and many were well positioned for this already, since this tends to be more a part of higher education than K-12. So this is certainly something that they had to move to full time and weren't necessarily prepared for. And then, of course, there's the same concerns around access to technology, both devices and internet service. And something that hasn't been brought up a lot, but in the teaching circles is of big concern are the pre-service teacher graduates who the teachers, the soon-to-be teachers who are in higher education, who were hoping to finish their student teaching, which cannot happen now, so they can't meet that requirement, and whether or not they're going to be able to sit for their licensure exams or even be eligible for licensure exams. And those teachers are gravely needed within the system while we have shortages, and so there's sure to be a concern about that. Graduation and grades are as much of a concern in higher ed as they are in K-12. And tuition and student loans. Student loans is a big area of concern, and so thankfully there's been some action at the federal level around that. As I mentioned, there's concerns around recruitment and admission. Some universities are delaying admission decisions until June, which means that the seniors who are graduating from high school won't know if they've been accepted into a university until summer, which really delays everything. And then there were a lot of international students who are stuck here or who quickly needed to return home back to their native country, and then also those students who were already studying abroad, and then also those programs going forward. Long-term effects for higher ed are very similar in some respects to K-12. We know that there will be some sort of an opportunity or an achievement gap, which also leads to equity concerns for students not having the same access that others may have, especially with the technology not being available to some students. As I mentioned, the admissions and recruitment is a long-term impact that universities and states will have to deal with. Long-term impact on job assistance for graduates in an economy that has slowed, and there's not that access right now to that on-campus assistance for those students. Student loans, of course, is a long-term issue that is important not only for students in the system, but those of us outside of the system who still have student loans, And we know higher ed budgets are sure to be dramatically impacted. They already had not recovered from the cuts from the Great Recession. And tuition has been rising very, very quickly at many institutions. And so the state higher education budgets are of great concern as we continue to see that revenue shortfall. At NCSL, we are tracking very closely the legislation that's related to education, and we have built an amazing tool really for all of you to use so that you can track what states are doing and the bills that we have. This particular slide is a little bit more of an up-close display of our bill tracking tool that we have. As you can see, I took this snapshot just a day ago. We had 39 bills. Now we have nearly 50 bills from 18 states. And this tool allows you to look at the pre-K bills, the higher education bills, and you can also look at them by status. A couple of states I wanted to point to are Ohio and New York and New Jersey. Most states actually adjourned before they were able to act much on education, and so we know that we'll see a lot more legislation coming up in the next few months as states get back to their sessions. But in Ohio, they went ahead and took a comprehensive approach to codify all of the waivers and the changes that the states had to make during this situation. In other states, some of those waivers are coming from the Commissioner of Education, but Ohio went ahead and put those right in statute. So issues around testing, around school attendance, the length of the school year, are all addressed in House Bill 585 in Ohio. In New Jersey, they have actually enacted 8 pieces of legislation addressing everything from school meals to virtual and remote instruction and school aid. And in New York, they've passed a good number of bills, 6 so far, that address the fiscal aspect in some respect of the impact of COVID and tuition payments. So we will keep tracking that legislation for you and have that all in depth for you so that you can see what other states are doing. And we also have a COVID-19 K-12 page as well as a higher education page where we are posting all of the both federal and state action on these issues. And then I also have the link right there to our education bill tracking database. So with that, I will give it back to you, Arturo.
Thank you, Michelle, for that excellent presentation and sharing information on K-12 state responses to COVID-19. Let's take some time to answer a few questions from the participants. For Jenny, what can legislators do to help ensure the working parents who depend on childcare still have access to care after this crisis passes?
Sure. I think, like I mentioned, making sure that that childcare providers are able to access the resources that are now available through the federal legislation. As I said, this is sort of uncharted territory for a lot of providers who have been ineligible for a lot of these benefits in the past. And so I think learning how to navigate the processes and knowing that the small business loans, for example, are going to be given first come, first serve. I think policymakers could leverage their contacts or their communities' resources to help make sure childcare providers are aware of those resources and know how to navigate them. It's going to be really important, not just for the providers, but also for families when they're ready to go back to work.
Thank you, Jenny. For Michelle, what would teacher evaluations look like for this school year, especially for districts that link student performance to teachers' overall rating?
Yeah, so we're just now seeing a robust conversation about that issue. Some states are discussing that right now, the states that are in session, and some are going to need to come back and address that because most of those teacher evaluations are now statutory. And we know that without the data, there's not the ability to evaluate teachers in the same way. So it's anticipated that a lot of those evaluation processes, just like the accountability systems for the states, will look very different this year, and they won't include that same data necessarily. And we do anticipate that state by state we'll start seeing that particular issue addressed.
Okay. One more question for you, Michelle. Are any states planning to extend the school year rather than continuing learning opportunities remotely while schools are closed?
Only one that we know of, and that is Hawaii. Most states are waiving the minimum number of days or hours that are required and relying on school districts to be offering learning opportunities for students while they're at home through the remainder of the school year. Hawaii is the only state that we know of who is considering not offering those opportunities and extending school through the summer. Of course, there's a really significant expense associated with that, and there are also issues with teacher contracts because most teachers technically are not employed by the school district during those times, and so they would need to work out some of those technicalities before they can move forward with that.
Thank you, Michelle. We will begin with our next presenter. Our next presenter is Austin Reed, who is the Director of NCSL Education Committee and NCSL's expert on federal education policy, who will be providing a summary of federal education and policy responses to the COVID-19 emergency. Austin?
Thanks, Arturo, and good afternoon to everybody. For my portion, I'm going to cover actions and guidance from Congress and the Department of Education for both K through 12 related responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's go ahead and start with K-12, and then we'll move to higher ed. So the stimulus package that passed last Friday provides a little under $31 billion for education. From that money, about $13.5 billion is going to go in formula grants to states for K-12 education. At least 90% of that money will go directly to districts, and those dollars can be used for a variety of needs. It should be noted that the intention of this funding generally is to immediately respond to challenges from the COVID-19 outbreak rather than compensate for any decreased revenue that states and districts might anticipate. So this funding can't extend the school year or pay for school buses. However, it can be used to provide educational services to low-income students, students with disabilities. The money can also go to purchasing technology for distance learning and activities to plan and coordinate distance learning. It can also be used to clean and sanitize buildings, as well as provide professional development for teachers. And it should also be noted that any money through the stabilization fund can also be used to fund any activity that is authorized under applicable K-12 laws. Of the, at least 90% of this money has to be sent to districts. However, a state may choose to reserve up to 10% of those funds to be allocated at the discretion of the statewide agency in order to respond to the COVID-19 emergency. And I should note that this money is allocated both at the state level and to districts based on their share of Title I funds. The stabilization fund also provides $3 billion to governors, which they can use at their discretion to address emergency needs in any education setting from early childhood to K-12 to higher ed. So between the governor's fund and the potential state education agency set aside, at the state level, states have some flexibility in directing their responses to the outbreak in addition to the enumerated uses of the funds in the stimulus package. There are a couple stipulations that I think are important to note with the stabilization fund. First, the Education Stabilization Fund includes a maintenance of effort provision, which says that states must maintain their spending on K-12 and higher education for the current fiscal year, FY20, and the next fiscal year. That is the spending that is at least equal to the spending that they've made on those two areas in the last 3 years. The bill also includes a stipulation that says that districts or any entity that receives these funds must continue to pay their employees to the extent practicable. And there is debate on what extent practicable means, and I understand that a number of organizations have reached out to the Department of Education for guidance. We are also seeking out guidance from the Department of Education on how the maintenance of effort will be calculated. I know I've reached out to them and I'm awaiting a response. It should be noted with the maintenance of effort that there is a clause that allows the Secretary to waive the maintenance of effort provision in the circumstances that a state has experienced a precipitous decline in state revenue. And so we are reaching out to the department to understand, one, how the maintenance of effort will be calculated, and two, what the conditions for waivers might look like. The stimulus package also includes a number of waivers for K through 12 education at both the state and district level. The first, it waives accountability provisions in the elementary and secondary Education Act. That includes waiving the state assessment requirement. I believe every state at this point has received that waiver, so states will not have to give any federally mandated testing this spring. The waiver process also allows states to pause their school-wide improvement identification so long as the schools that they've identified for improvement this year are still identified for improvement next year. The waivers also allow states to exclude certain data from their state report cards for this year or the time in which they've been affected by the COVID-19 outbreak. The stimulus bill also provides various waivers that LEAs can request that allows them additional funding flexibility. For example, it allows any school to operate a school-wide program, which allows schools to take their federal funds and their state and local funds and combine that into one pot of money that they can allocate more flexibly to general school needs and upgrade the entire school-wide program. The bill also allows schools to carry over more than 15% of their Title I funds to the next academic year. And it also provides additional flexibilities in the Title IV-A block grant, which is a fairly flexible pot of money. One thing to note in here is that under current law, only 15% of those funds can be used to purchase technology. However, districts, I should say, can request waivers from that provision and use the entirety of their remaining Title IV funds to purchase technology. Now, even with all of these waivers on accountability provisions and funding flexibilities, it should be pointed out that the law does not waive civil rights laws, such as the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, but it does require the Secretary of Education to make recommendations on IDEA flexibilities for Congress to consider, and that report should be offered in the next 30 days. I think one of the biggest challenges that districts are facing right now is how to educate students with disabilities through a distance learning environment. And the Department of Education has issued multiple guidance documents so far towards answering this question. Earlier this month, they released an FAQ document that basically said if schools were closed and not providing education to the general student population, then they did not need to provide educational services to students with disabilities. However, they said if a school was operating under a distance learning model, then it must serve all students, including students with disabilities. Now, we've heard reports that in response to that, there are a number of districts that have chosen to remain closed because they fear that if they go to a distance learning model, they will not be in compliance with providing a free and appropriate education for students with disabilities. So a couple of weeks ago on Saturday, the department issued supplementary guidance that said that federal law should not prevent schools from providing distance learning from all students. It provided some guidance as to how to provide accommodations through distance learning for students with less severe disabilities, but it didn't provide any specific approaches for how you would provide distance education for students with moderate to severe disabilities. However, the department said that they are working on offering technical assistance and are currently directing inquiries to the National Center for Systemic Improvement. My understanding is that states are also issuing their own guidance on how to serve students with disabilities, and the education community writ large is trying to answer this question. The department has also issued guidance on student privacy. The gist of this guidance is that if a student contracts the coronavirus, the school can alert its education community that the student has these health concerns, but the school must not identify that student or provide information that may expose that student's identity. On higher education, the Stabilization Fund provides a little over $14 billion directly to institutions of higher education. From that money, 90% is going to go directly to institutions, and that is based on their relative share of Pell students. So the more low-income students in a university enrolls, the more money they should expect to receive. From these funds, at least 50% must be used as emergency aid for students, and that emergency aid can cover anything that would be considered a student's cost of attendance. That can include food, purchasing technology, providing childcare, and accessing healthcare. The remaining funds from that money can be used by institutions to offset any revenue that they may have lost during the outbreak, as well as paid for increased technological costs. The CARES Act also provides additional waivers for students and institutions. For example, if a student withdraws from their semester early because of the COVID-19 emergency, they do not have to pay back any of their student loans or Pell Grants that they took out for the semester. It also allows federal work-study funds to continue to be paid out if a student is unable to work but was scheduled to work. And perhaps the most wide-reaching provision in the stimulus package for education pertains to student loans. So for the next 6 months through September 30th, all federal student loan payments are automatically deferred, and the interest on those loans is waived through the next 6 months. That includes most federal student loans. However, it does not include private student loans, and there are two student loan programs that are excluded from this policy. That includes Perkins Loan Program, which is debt that is held by universities, and it also includes another program that was discontinued in 2010 that is held by private lenders. But essentially, if a student loan is held by the federal government, which is most federal student loans, then it will qualify for this automatic payment deferral and interest waiver. It should also be noted that each month of this deferral period still counts towards loan forgiveness programs. So these 6 months will count towards public service loan forgiveness, income-driven repayment plans, and also applies to student loan rehabilitation. And each month of these deferred payments will be reported to credit reporting agencies as if they had been made. It should be noted that students or borrowers can continue to pay back their loans, but are not under any requirements to do so. The stimulus package also halts collection actions and wage garnishment on all defaulted student loans, and also provides a provision that allows companies to pay up to a little over $5,000 of their employees' student loan payments for just this year on a tax-free basis. And that can apply to any qualified student loan, which should include most federal and private student loans. Thanks for your time. I yield my time back to Arturo. Thanks.
Thank you, Austin, for that great presentation and federal update. I know that Austin's presentation raised questions with the participants. Please type those into the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Our next presenter is Ann Morse, who is Federal Affairs Counsel for NCSL's Hunger Partnership and directs NCSL's work on immigration. She will present on nutrition program changes and funding. Ann?
Hey, thank you, Arturo, and welcome everyone. Thanks for being on today's call. Schools are being remarkably creative in their efforts to continue learning opportunities for children during the pandemic school closures. But what about students who rely on school meals and now have no food to eat? Normally, 30 million students eat school lunch every day, and 22 million of these children rely on free or reduced price school lunch. The legislation Congress enacted in the last 2 weeks appropriates a total of $26.41 billion in new food assistance, including $8.8 billion for child nutrition programs. Importantly, it also offers extended waiver authorities to avoid some of the administrative requirements during this time. And does this slide move? I need help here. So this slide shows the 6 areas where the $26 billion is allocated to the child nutrition programs, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which are the 2 largest federal nutrition assistance programs, and also funding for WIC, Community Food, Native American nutrition programs, and nutrition assistance to the territories. And I'm sorry, I still can't move slides. Thank you. So today's presentation is primarily on school meals and also SNAP. For questions on the other programs, please contact me after the webinar. The 4 feeding programs we're talking about in K through 12 are school lunch, school breakfast, summer food, and after school meals and snacks. Next slide, please. Thank you. This puts in context for you the National School Lunch Program, how long it was established back in 1946. It's our oldest program. As I mentioned, 30 million students receive it every day. Meals are free for households under 130% of the federal poverty level, and at reduced cost for households under 185% of the federal poverty level, which this year is $26,200 for a family of 4. Funding in 2018, which is the latest I have, is $13.8 billion, and you can see the reimbursement rates for lunch, $3.43 a meal, for breakfast, $2.20 a meal. A link to the participation by state is available to you. Next slide, please. In National School Breakfast started in 1966 and permanent in 1975. We're serving about half the rate in school breakfast as we are for school lunch, so we still have some area to improve there once, of course, we're back in school. Funding in 2018 was $4.4 billion, and you can see participation by state at that link. Next slide, please. Summer food service program is available through sponsors and either schools, local government, nonprofit agencies, or food banks, and these are done through contracts. And the campaign would normally start about this time of year, so I'm sure we'll be seeing some more guidance on how to take better advantage of this program. With the new program, with the new congressional law, we are allowed to directly deliver meals to students' home with the state agency approval to the current sponsors of school sites. We're really low in providing summer meals compared to the other programs. Only 1 in 6 children who receive free or reduced price lunch receive summer meals. And there are a variety of barriers, either transportation, lack of knowledge, availability of programs in their area. And finally, we have after-school meals, which can be provided either after school or also through the Child and Adult Care Food Program, which can be on weekends. Next slide, please. I'm ripping through these. And that is really small for you to read. Let me find my own slide. Okay. Sorry for the pause. So the school price, this is the waiver page. So all the nationwide waivers that USDA is able to allow states and school districts to apply are the waiver of the group settings requirement, so known as the congregate requirement. Requirements around when meals can be served, the activities required for after school, and localized meal patterns. Meals may be served to all children 18 and under in the household if at least one child attends the dismissed school. Thank you. So these waivers allowed for states to recognize the social distancing and allowed schools to be creative in their responses. What some schools have done is created grab-and-go meals at central locations. They have used their school buses to deliver meals along the routes for their pickup and drop-off for students, and also establish some hotlines. It's important to note that states must still submit requests for other waivers they might see needed in their community. USDA is also approving state requests to waive area eligibility for summer meals programs. I'm going to move on to SNAP next, I believe. One more. So one of the really interesting possibilities here is to use pandemic EBT. Because the kids are no longer in schools, children who are receiving free or reduced price meals are now eligible to receive an electronic benefit transfer card loaded with the equivalent of their free breakfast and lunch in the state. State child nutrition and SNAP agencies must jointly apply to USDA, and there's also an option for families who are not currently on SNAP. Now I can go to SNAP. Thank you. The largest food program, as I mentioned before, was a SNAP program created in '61, made permanent in '64. Nearly half of all people receiving SNAP, so the children who are receiving school lunch and school breakfast, are most likely eligible to receive SNAP, and it's important to try to figure out ways to bring more people onto the SNAP program during this time. Households with children receive 2/3 of all SNAP benefits. SNAP benefits can only be used for food, and the average benefit is $1.40 per person per meal. Participation rate, I think I had an update of about 40 million Americans receive SNAP each month, and the cost is now $57 billion. So somewhat fewer people are on SNAP as of 2018. We're obviously going to see that adjust. I think I may have come to the end of my rapid response here. I did not. The waivers include a suspension of the rule that was going to require work requirements for the 3-month time period for able-bodied adults without dependents. It allows states to increase monthly allotments to the maximum benefit per household size. Not all states are providing the maximum benefit per household, so that's one area where you can increase assistance to people who are currently on SNAP. There are extended certification periods and changed interview requirements, so the additional waivers to make things more flexible for states. Next slide, please. And here are our resources pages. And so I was going to mention a few examples from the states at this point. New Jersey legislature approved a bill that would require states to provide meals or vouchers to students eligible for free and reduced meals. School distribution sites must be within walking distance or delivered to their residents or a bus stop near them. Legislators have also been asking us how WIC participants can fulfill their food packages when grocery stores are running out of critical items such as milk or eggs, and seeking waivers for extensions of the WIC coupons. States are also applying to USDA for a waiver of SNAP college student eligibility criteria, and they're asking USDA for bans on purchases of hot or prepared meals under SNAP. Neither of those guidances have been issued by USDA so far. And that is all I have for you. Thank you, Arturo.
Thank you, Anne, for wrapping up our presentations with excellent information on nutrition programs. The remaining time will now be dedicated to Q&A. Remember to type in your questions in the chat box. For Austin, are college students eligible for the direct payments to individuals?
Thanks, Arturo. That's a good question. If the college student is considered a dependent or is on their parents' tax forms or by their guardian's tax forms, then no, they would not be eligible. Outside of that, and typically for tax purposes, a student is considered a dependent if they're under the age of 24 and a parent pays for at least half of their expenses. Outside of that, so long as a student's status at a university or college shouldn't affect their recipient of payment for this, so long as they're a tax-paying citizen, I believe they will be eligible, although I can't comment on every unique circumstance. But we know dependents for sure will be excluded from this policy, but outside of that, I believe that a student would be treated just as any other citizen under this policy.
Thank you, Austin. For Anne, we have a question. Any suggestions on what legislators should do next?
Oh, thanks for asking that. I've been getting so many questions. The first thing I think legislators should look at is helping get the state pandemic EBT up and running. This is a 100% federally funded benefit expansion. Try to use ways that rely on technology and limit the need for individual families to apply for benefits. Also consider the need to address potential funding shortfalls for school nutrition, such as the cost of meal delivery, because that is not covered by the federal government. Look at ways to provide the additional amounts to bring families up to the maximum benefit allowed. I know that Indiana is increasing their benefits starting next week. And finally, more ideas on child nutrition partnerships and support can be found on our website at ncsl.org/hunger.
Okay, there is another question for you, Anne, here, and it's from Heather Klutz. Is the PEBT in addition to whatever handout meals that are provided?
Yes. I believe so. Okay. If I can call on Sean, if you have anything to add. Not at this time. We'll
hi,
get
this
that
is Sean.
out. Oh, you got it?
Yes, I don't actually know that off the top of my head, but I can find that answer and send it to you.
Thank you.
All right. We do have another question here from Lydia Shu, and it's, are there two separate MOE requirements, one for K-12 and one for higher ed, or is it expenditures on those two areas combined?
Thanks, Lydia. That's a good question. I've reached out to the department to get official word on this, so I won't comment any further. I did put in the chat box the guidance on the maintenance of effort from the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund from 2010, which I think has been worthwhile reading. But until we receive official guidance, I will hold off on answering that question. But I can let you know that we have reached out to the department to learn not only how they're going to calculate this maintenance of effort, but under what conditions they might grant a waiver.
This next question is from Amanda Johnson. Will LEAs need to apply for funding from the state, or will the funding to LEAs be automatic?
That's another good question. Based on my read of the bill, I don't recall any provisions that lay out what the distribution process from state education agency to LEA will look like. I imagine that the department will lay that out in subsequent guidance. Because I haven't seen any word in the statute on how that allocation process would be happen, I would imagine that would be up to states to determine how they allocate those money. I know in Title II funds, states are given a fair amount of latitude as to how they distribute those to schools, whether they do it automatically or have an application process. So this could be something that's left up to states, but I think we need to wait until we hear from the department as to specifically how they intend for states to distribute these funds to local education agencies, although I imagine that expediency is the most important thing. So hopefully this would be a pretty easy and streamlined process to get those funds to schools that need them.
There's a question here from Deborah Gottschalk. Should schools be worried about providing remote learning programs that don't offer opportunities for students with IEPs to engage them?
That's a tough question. I think that is the question that everybody in the education community is worrying about right now. The department issued guidance, which isn't regulation, on serving students with disabilities during distance learning model, and you can read that multiple different ways, but it doesn't really have any legal standing. And so I think there's a lot of school districts that are concerned that they still may expose themselves to legal liabilities and due process claims from operating this program. And so I think that there's some demand out there for more guidance from the department. I'm not sure if we're going to get that. There's also been a discussion about providing schools with waivers from certain IDEA provisions so that schools can operate in a distance learning model without fear of litigation, but that remains to be seen as well. What I've heard from the disability community is that if schools are making their best effort and they're documenting what they're doing and they're proving that they're doing the best they can given the circumstances, that should be sufficient, at least for federal monitoring purposes. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that lawyers won't continue to file due process claims. So again, this is a very tough issue. I think it's going to be probably the biggest issue that we're discussing in the education community over the next month. And so I know schools and districts are worried about going to a distance model. And I think in many of those places, those concerns are in some ways warranted. And we're trying to figure out, how can schools provide services to students without fear that they're out of compliance with IDEA.
Thank you, Austin. At this time, as we are approaching the end of our 1 hour of the webinar, I would like to thank our presenters again for sharing their time and expertise on today's webinar. In the next few days, we will post the archive of this webinar on our webpage. Go to www.ncsl.org, click on our COVID-19 response resource page, and scroll down to webinars. The archive link will appear next to the name of the webinar. Thank you all for your participation, and stay well. This concludes our webinar today. Thank you.